I am more excited about the radio that I'm reviewing today than I have been about, well, I'm not going to say anything in a long time, but when I powered this radio on, my face lit up. The radio that I'm reviewing today is the Jumper T15. And in order to understand why I'm so excited about it, I want to tell you about the RadioMaster Boxer Crush, which is my daily driver. Well, the RadioMaster Boxer has been my daily driver for a while now, pretty much since the Boxer came out. The Boxer Crush is an updated version of the Boxer. You know what they updated? The color. It's a cosmetic rebrand. And I love a cosmetic rebrand. I asked them to send me one of these in hot pink, and I said, I'm not going to review it. I'm not going to make a whole new review video about the radio when all you did was put a color shell on it. But I'll accept one for free, and I'll use it as my daily driver, and I'll mention that you did that for me in videos. Now I've fulfilled that obligation. But my policy is I'm going to review something when it's legitimately interesting, when it brings something legitimately new to the table, and oh my gosh, the Jumper T15 absolutely ticks that box. Because if we look at the Jumper T15, we can see that it is more or less the same form factor as the Boxer. And I freaking love that. I love this form factor. It is just big enough to be comfortable in your hands, but not so humongous that it feels oversized. But you know what the Boxer doesn't have?
Welcome to HTX.
It doesn't have a giant color touchscreen. Yes, it's a touchscreen. Basically, the Jumper T15 gives us the big color touchscreen from the RadioMaster TX16S in the small form factor of the RadioMaster Boxer, and that is pretty freaking exciting. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Now that we've introduced the product, let's take a step back and let's pretend that you don't know anything about this radio. And I'm not going to spend too long doing the remedial stuff because most of you do know some things about this radio. But I know there's people out there who are just getting into the hobby and maybe need a little bit of a refresher. So if you already feel like you understand like what a radio is, what ExpressLRS is, and so forth, then there's chapter markers down in the video description. You can just skip to the next chapter if you want to. This won't take long, though. Obviously, this is a radio controller for an RC, well, multi-rotor usually, although it could be used to control anything. And the main thing you need to know about this is that this has built in a radio protocol called ExpressLRS. ExpressLRS is incredibly long range, incredibly good penetration. It is open source, and that means there's a whole bunch of different manufacturers who make ExpressLRS hardware, and all of it is cross-compatible and interoperable and not that expensive. ExpressLRS is really wonderful for people in the RC hobby. It does have some technical hurdles. It's a little bit of a learning curve to get into it. Not quite as simple as the old style, like, I press the bind button, I press the bind button, everything is bound, and that's all I need to think about. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but once you get over the learning curve, it's pretty freaking amazing. So, if you get this radio, please know that you will not be binding it to your FreeSky receivers, your Spectrum receivers, your FlySky receivers, your Crossfire receivers, your Tracer receivers, etc., etc., etc. It'll bind to ExpressLRS receivers. However, if we flip it over, yes, there is a module bay in the back, and you could put a module in there that would do any one of those protocols. So actually, technically, yes, you can use it with those. You'll just have to buy an aftermarket module. But most people who buy this radio are probably going to be primarily using it with ExpressLRS receivers. That's just where the world of multi-rotors is gone in the last few years. The other thing you need to know about this radio is that it runs an operating system called EdgeTX. You can see it here in the upper left. And the exciting thing about EdgeTX is that all these radios run EdgeTX. And that means that in the same way that you could sit down to a Mac OS or a Windows PC, I could hand you an iPhone or I could hand you an Android phone. And for the most part, it wouldn't matter which specific iPhone it was or which specific Android phone it was, which Windows computer, etc. You could sit down and the interface, everything would kind of be where you would expect it to be, and you would be able to sort of make it work. That's the beautiful thing about EdgeTX radios. EdgeTX is also open source, by the way, so it's easy for manufacturers to put it on their hardware, and all these radios, pretty much all the radios that are popular in the world of FPV, run that operating system. So if you decide one day you want to use a Boxer and one day you want to use a Jumper T15, all of your knowledge about how to set up and configure the radio is going to transfer over. The downside is that it's also a little bit more complicated than you might be used to if you're coming from something like a Spectrum radio, where things are a little bit more sort of tailored, but it's also incredibly powerful and incredibly functional. In order to help you understand why this touchscreen is such a big deal, let me just interact with it a little bit. We'll go to model settings and I can swipe and scroll and there's various things I can do. Oh, we'll configure the internal RF. There we go. We can tap and configure that. We can do all kinds of things. There's a back button here, which backs us out. There's also a menu button and a page button here. If you don't want to tap around, you can see here, we can just tap around, or we can hit the page button to scroll through the different pages. Those buttons are a relic of the days when we didn't have a touch screen, and many people will just out of habit and tradition prefer to use them. But a lot of people coming to this fresh will really love the touchscreen. It's not the most responsive touchscreen, I have to say. And there are ways in which the touchscreen interface of EdgeTX is a little bit clunky. Like these little buttons here, it's a little web design from 2004 kind of feel, but it definitely gets the job done. However, compare to the RadioMaster Boxer, and you'll see, well, first of all, there's no touchscreen. We're going to use these buttons, and we'll sort of go through the menus, and you can see, well, you probably don't necessarily see this because you don't spend years and years looking at EdgeTX like I do, but all of the options that were in the big color touchscreen, they're all there. It's just all like a text-based instead of a sort of a more graphical based readout. And so I gotta scroll and I gotta click and I gotta edit and then I gotta scroll and I gotta click and I gotta edit. And just the whole process of doing it is just a little more clunky. As someone with years of experience, I can rock this. I just, I do whatever I want to do, but it's going to be easier for most people to work with the graphical interface. I do have to say though, this thing drains your battery a lot slower. We don't have the exact same battery in both of these radios, so we can't do a fair comparison. There's other things going on, but there's just no doubt that this big color touchscreen is going to run your battery down faster. Although there are timers that will make it dim or turn off, so you probably can mitigate that to some degree. One of the coolest things about this big touchscreen is you can add all kinds of information to it. You see it's just kind of a blank canvas here. I've put a couple widgets on here, but they're kind of lame. Let me actually show you my RadioMaster TX16S, which I have set up with all kinds of custom information. You can see here, I've got my channel readout on the left side. I've got my link quality, RSSI on the right side. And then up at the top, I've got these little widgets here showing my battery, my transmit power, my receiver battery, and so on. And I can just glance down at that screen and I can just see all that information. I can even create multiple screens that I roll through. I've only got, well, the second screen is empty, but it is so customizable, and it's really something I missed when I switched over to the Boxer. I really like the ability to just glance down and have this information right at my fingertips. On the Boxer, I can press the telemetry button, and I get this screen, which has some of that same information, but it's just not as nice. And I have to press a button to get there. The controls on the Jumper T15 are pretty standard for radios of this form factor. We've got 4 3-position switches up here. We've got 2 potentiometer knobs. We can turn back and forth. And on the shoulders, we've got a 2-position switch here and a momentary switch here that resets when you release it. And that's actually it for the controls on the radio. People who fly big, complicated planes with lots of control surfaces, flaps and landing gear and lights and I don't even know what else, might prefer the RadioMaster TX16S, which has more controls, significantly more controls. But many people who fly multi-rotors are going to be perfectly happy with the number of switches that we have here. I do have to say, it's a little frustrating to me that there isn't a 2-position switch here. If we look at the RadioMaster Boxer, that switch is a 2-position switch. And it annoys me because I like this switch to be my arm switch, and arming is an on-off 2-position function. Now, there are people who are going to say, but Bardwell, why don't you just use this as your arm switch? And yes, some people will do that. But personally, if I'm going to arm or disarm, I want to arm, disarm. I want that to be a really sort of positive, secure, no BS an instantaneous. I want it to be instantaneous. Do you see that if I needed to disarm in a hurry, so here I'm armed. If I needed to disarm in a hurry, I have to press the switch and then release the switch, right? It is a compound movement. Press and release. And to me, like if I'm disarming, I want to just disarm, right? Disarming can be something that you have to do like in an emergency. And so I also find this muscle movement a little cumbersome, a little awkward. Like if I'm flying and I go to disarm, like, right? I don't know. Whereas if I'm flying and I go to disarm, there you go, boom, done, disarm, arm, disarm, right? It's like so second nature to me. I'm sure there are going to be people out there, especially people with larger hands, who maybe don't agree with this assessment, but to me, wish that was a 2-position. You could just make it a 3-position arm switch, just disarm and then 2 arm positions. It's a minor quibble, but it's my quibble. There's an additional input here at the center of the radio that we haven't talked about yet, and it is a 6-position set of switches. So you can see as I press here, it's going through one of these 6 positions. And you can assign that, for example, to flight modes, especially on more like complicated birds like ArduPilot birds, where you might have, like on a Betaflight bird, what flight modes are you going to have? It's not like you have return to home, altitude hold, etc., etc. But on more complicated birds, people might use these for flight modes. Now, on a lot of radios with this 6-position switch, the functionality is kind of limited, and a lot of people don't use it. You see, the way that most radios implement this 6-position switch is, it's basically just like a slider or one of these potentiometer knobs where you twist it from left to right. In other words, this switch is basically one switch that can be in one of 6 positions. This one, this one, this one, and so forth. But like, for example, why can't I just decide that this one here is an on-off toggle, and these 3 here are 1, 2, 3, like radio buttons. You have one of the 3. And then these 2 here are a separate grouping of radio buttons. Well, the Jumper can actually do that. Let me demonstrate in case that's not really clear. Here in the Jumper, if I tap and then go to Model Settings and scroll down to Customizable Switches, I can actually change how these switches are grouped. So for example, switch number 1 is going to be a 2-pos or a toggle. It's my choice, see? Or I can turn it off. That's what the none option is, but I don't know why you would do that. So let's make switches 1 and 2 be in group 1. Switches 2 and 3 and 4 be in group 2. And switch 6, or sorry, I got the numbering wrong there, but you see what I've done. We've got one group of 2 switches, one group of 1, 2, 3 switches, and one group of 1 switch. And then let's make this be a toggle, and a toggle. Okay, so now if I then look at how these switches work, notice that I can, do you see that now these 2 switches are in group 1. I can toggle them on and off, right? And if I press 1 and then 2, it toggles between them, right? Off, on, off, or toggle between them, right? Here, for group number 2, which is switches 3, 4, and 5. Oh, interesting. So this one, these switches are momentaries. That must be what toggle is. You can see that when I release it, they turn off. When I press it, they turn on. And then for switch 6 is a 2-position. Here we've just got a completely separate 2-position here, right? That's pretty freaking cool. We can just break these up and customize exactly how they work for whatever we need. Like, I could just make each of these 6 different momentary switches if that's what I wanted to do. Oh, look at that. I can even change how they start up. I can have them turn all off. I can have them turn on with switch number 1 enabled or switch number 2 enabled. So I can set the default position at power up time based on however I've decided that these switches work and whatever their functionality needs to be. That's really slick. What does always on mean? Well, always on must mean, I see. So now they're not momentaries anymore. Now they're mutually exclusive. Aha! So now group number 1 can be off. One of them can be on or off, or they can be exclusive to each other and switch between them. Whereas group number 2, because I've enabled the always on option, they are mutually exclusive, but you can never turn them off. They're just always enabled. They're no longer momentaries. It's like a selector 1, 2, 3. And then group number 3 with always on enabled, since there's only a single switch in group 3, it just means you can never turn it off. There we go. That's really cool. I love the amount of functionality that they've got there. And holy crap, they've even put a QR code at the bottom, which presumably is documentation for all how this crap works. because it's fairly obscure and pretty much, I'm not going to say only Jumper radios do it, but it's pretty much Jumper radios that do it. I guess technically we have an additional control here. These are trim switches, and if you've got an airplane, the trim switches are used to trim out the control surfaces. I do have to point out though, like traditionally you would want these like accessible while you're flying. They would be like around the side of the gimbal. I guess these are pretty accessible. Like if I was flying and I real quick wanted to reach over and trim out an aileron or a rudder or something, that'll work. You have to take your hand off the sticks, but you kind of always have to do that for trimming. I suppose it's not the end of the world. If you're not flying an airplane, you don't need to trim out your control surfaces. Those trim switches can also be used for an arbitrary function. So I guess you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more momentary switches that you could do whatever you want with if you needed extra momentary switches. I really like the folding antenna on the Jumper T15. You can see here it folds down and it will actually pivot here if you would need it to be in vertical orientation to match the orientation of the antenna on your aircraft. I really like it because like I'm constantly stuffing my RadioMaster Boxer in a backpack, and over time this antenna, which is a very high quality, good performing antenna, it kind of gets bent when I stuff it in the backpack, and eventually it wears out and it breaks. The advantage of the RadioMaster approach is that I can actually unscrew this antenna and I can screw another like high performance antenna, high gain antenna on there. The disadvantage is that it's just not as packable. And to be honest with you, I've never connected this up to an external like ground station with a high gain antenna. ExpressLRS has really more range than most people are going to need, even on a stock antenna. So to me, the Jumper choice of having a foldable integrated antenna makes a lot of sense. I kind of wish that the RadioMaster had a similar setup. Does mean that I'm not going to be able to easily get in here and like measure the output power of this radio because I don't have access to a plug to plug into. I guess unless I open it up and like unplug the antenna, but that seems a little extreme. I can't help but notice here on the top of the radio there are 2 rubber plugs, and they just are filling in these holes which are located exactly where I would put 2 more switches if I wanted to add 2 more switches. It makes me wonder whether they've got plugs on the main board for 2 additional switches that you can add after the fact if you were looking for additional connectivity. I haven't been able to confirm that, but it is very interesting that these holes are here, and I can't think what else they would be for if not that. Continuing our walk around the radio, we've got a USB port here, and this is used both for charging the radio, and the radio is advertised as having up to 10-watt charging over USB-C. Let's test that actually. This here is a SpeedyB adapter, and it's made for powering your goggles, but it'll just do USB fast charging. So let's go ahead and plug it in, and what do we get? 5 volts, 2 amps. 5 volts, 2 amps, that's 10 watts. Well, that's exactly what's advertised. It's not exactly fast charging, is it? 5 volts, 2 amps. That's, oh my God, I've been horribly misled. I saw in the marketing materials, it said 10 watt charging. And I thought, oh, that's impressive, 10 watts. No, 10 watts is just standard 5 volt, 2 amp. Such an idiot. Scratch everything I said about fast charging. It just does regular, slow charging. Such an idiot, dumbass. One nice thing about Jumper radios as relates to charging is that Jumper radios charge and USB over the same USB port. If we look at the RadioMaster Boxer, we can see that there is a USB port on the bottom for charging and a USB port on the top for connecting to the computer. How fast does the Boxer charge? Just out of curiosity. 5 volts, 1 amp. Oh, no, there's 7 volts, 2 amps. Yeah, 7 volts. It's going up to, it's doing a higher, it'll charge a little bit faster. Well, just a little bit faster. But the downside of that is that if you're playing on the simulator, and by the way, in case you didn't know, you can plug this into your computer, just plug right into this USB port on top, and then select USB joystick, and this will act as a game controller on your computer, and you can use it to fly the simulator in your computer. It's just that simple. With the Jumper radio, the radio is charging while you're plugged in, and it won't run down your batteries, and that's kind of nice. Earlier in the video, I told you that this radio runs the EdgeTX operating system, and I want to sort of springboard off of that into telling you why this radio review will not contain some things that you would find in a typical radio review. You see, typically when you review an RC radio, you're going to talk about the features of the operating system. Does it support 6 channels, 8 channels, 12 channels? How many mixes does it support? What kind of options does it have for setting up like custom mixes and custom wing configurations and so forth? And we don't have to do any of that when we're reviewing an Edge TX radio because, first of all, it supports it all. Like, how many channels do you want? How many channels does your receiver have? It supports all of them. How many mixes do you want? It supports more than most people are going to need. So in terms of functionality, if you're wondering if it does it, it probably does it. But more importantly, the Edge TX radios are sort of designed to work with the flight controllers and with the receiver systems that are used on FPV drones. So, this just is what you're going to get. And you get what you get, and it's probably more than you need, and that's just that. There really isn't a viable way to use a non-Edge TX radio with an FPV drone. I realize that's a little bit of a controversial statement and maybe a little bit overstated. I know there are people out there flying FPV drones with other radios that don't run it. There are so many hurdles to doing that, and there are reasons why you're jumping those hurdles. Maybe you just love your radio and you want to use it and it's worth it for you. But for anybody who's thinking about buying a new radio in the FPV space, that radio should run Edge TX, hands down, no question. And then once it runs it, you don't need to use that as a deciding factor of which radio to buy. They all run Edge TX. They all have the same number of mixes and channels and features. They all do the same thing. The only distinguishing characteristics that make you choose one radio over the other are things like the physical form factor of the radio, the number of physical controls, the size of the screen, and so forth. And that's why we're focusing on those things in this video, because they're not distinguishing characteristics. And then after you buy the radio, you'll start learning to use it, and you'll learn how to set up switches, how to set up mixes, and so forth. And that's all for the tutorial after you've settled on a radio. I said earlier that this radio has ExpressLRS built in, and not all ExpressLRS radios have the same features. Specifically, the output power of the radio may differ. This radio does go to the full output power. Let's just long press the sys key, and we'll go to the tools menu here, and we'll run the ExpressLRS script. Hello, there we go. And we can see here, if we scroll down, we can scroll down to the transmit power of the module. And it is interestingly set to 25 milliwatts, the minimum power, which is, we would think you would want to set it at a higher power so people who bought the radio would get more range. If you do buy this radio, go ahead and change this, just like you saw me do. You can update the power to as high as 1 watt. And that is actually the max power for basically all ExpressLRS radios with internal modules. There are a few external modules that'll go up to 2 watts, but even they are pretty rare. 1 watt is pretty much the ceiling. And in case you're wondering, is 1 watt enough? Do I need more? You can go 100 kilometers. Well, under ideal conditions, like one person went 100 kilometers on 1 watt. So, 1 watts is enough. You're not going to get 100 kilometers, but you're flying around your backyard, flying around a park, flying around a bando, it's fine. 1 watt's fine. Now, if I set this to 1 watt, this little cooling fan in the back is going to start blowing because over, I think it's 250 milliwatts is where it kicks in. Yeah, that's the default fan threshold here. And I don't want that fan to start blowing at me, so I'm just going to set it to 100 milliwatts and leave it that way. By the way, if you need a primer on ExpressLRS, how do you bind an ExpressLRS radio? How do you even get started with it? I have a video that I'm going to refer you to. I'm going to link it in the video description below, and it's the easiest way to flash and bind ExpressLRS. And ExpressLRS has a learning curve, and that will be sort of where you will begin to approach and hopefully start to overcome that learning curve. Well, we can't review a radio without talking about its gimbals. And let me just start by saying that the gimbals on the Jumper T15 are fine. My opinion is that as long as the gimbals are kind of minimally functional, then they're not going to be the thing that holds you back as a pilot. I have seen much better pilots than me do amazing things that I could never reproduce on radios with relatively cheap gimbals, not super ultra premium metal CNC ball bearing, yada, yada, yada. But the gimbals on the Jumper T15 are fine. They are Hall effect. That's good. That means that there is not a potentiometer inside here measuring the position. There is a magnetic Hall effect sensor, and that means that the gimbals will essentially last forever. They're not going to wear out and stop recentering after Like one of my radios, after about 2 years of flying, the gimbal started to wear out. And when I would recenter the stick, the gimbal wouldn't actually feel like it was centered. And I was constantly having to recalibrate them. And that was my sign that it was time to replace the gimbal. How fast that would happen to you on a non-Hall sensor gimbal would depend on how many hours of flight time you put in. For most people, though, they're never going to wear out the gimbals. And if they're Hall effect gimbals, they're really never going to wear them out. They're just going to work fine for as long as you own the radio. I do have to say, there are some things about these gimbals that I don't like very much compared to the RadioMaster gimbals. Now, some are going to point out that this is the most ultra premium RadioMaster gimbal. This is the AGO1 gimbal. It's full metal CNC. It's a very premium. These gimbals alone cost something like $130 for a set, which is much as you might spend on a whole freaking radio. But the things I'm going to say about these gimbals don't depend on them being AGO1s. The AGO1s are nice, but again, not really a must-have. The thing I like most about the RadioMaster gimbal is that it has these 4 adjustment screws on the face of the radio. And that means you can adjust things like the spring tension, the centering, and the vertical travel without ever opening up the radio. As far as I can tell, the Jumper doesn't have that. Yes, we have some screws here, but those screws don't seem to be adjustment screws. They just seem to be there sort of holding the gimbal together. And on some radios, if you open up the back of the radio, there will be holes here that you can stick a screwdriver through to adjust the screws on the gimbal to make those adjustments. And those aren't here either. It sure seems like you would have to actually open the radio up in order to adjust the gimbal. And that's a shame because, well, it means most people just aren't going to adjust the gimbal. They're just going to fly it on the defaults. And like I said, the defaults are fine, but maybe you would prefer a little more stick travel. Maybe you want to convert it from mode 2 to mode 1. So you've got throttle on the right and you need this to not be recentering. Well, you're going to be opening the radio up. As far as the ergonomics of the radio go, I'm pretty happy with it. Like, I feel like it's a little bit wider than the Boxer. It feels just a little bigger than the Boxer in my hand. But I like the way that these ridges sort of sit in the hand. I like this little ledge here for your index finger or your middle finger, depending on how you do it. Or I guess in my case, my ring finger, because this is how I would normally hold the radio. Pinch the sticks, fingers up here, resting on the top. Yeah, that's how I would normally do it. The ergonomics are fine. I'm able to get full travel on the sticks, no problem. It's really good for someone with my size of hands. And I think it's going to be good for people with maybe even a little bit smaller hands, although the very, very smallest hands, like kids or really small adults, might prefer one of those gamepad style radios like the RadioMaster Zorro, which is going to be just a little bit smaller even still. But I think most people are going to be able to make this work and find it comfortable and easy to use. We haven't looked at the batteries yet. I really like that this comes with a battery bay for 21700 sized lithium ion cells. It does not come with the cells. And if you want to know, I'll put a link in the video description below to the exact cells that I bought. These are 4900 milliamp hour cells. These are really high quality 21700 cells, almost 5000 milliamp hours. So they're going to give you a lot of battery life. And you might be thinking, well, should I get like an aftermarket battery that fits into this case? Well, you can. Like this, I didn't even realize this at first, but this thing lifts out. There it is. It lifts out and it unplugs. Come on, come out of there. It doesn't want to. I don't know why it doesn't want to, and I don't want to break something. It does lift out, though, and you can put a standard battery in there, but I don't know why you would, because you can see it is perfectly sized for a 21700 size. It's filling the battery bay, at which point, what are you going to gain by using a different aftermarket battery? I definitely think just get some good quality 21700s and put them in there, and you'll be good to go. All right, let's figure out how this all stacks up. I've got here what I think are the main radios that this radio sort of slots up against. And I guess we'll start with the TX16S. This radio is about $200, and that is for the base model. That is not for the max model, which comes with the upgraded AGO1 CNC metal gimbals, which, as I've said before, are a nice upgrade, not mandatory, but it is nice that they're an option if you want to spend another $100 or so to get just these premium gimbals. So $200 for this radio. It has the most controls, right? All the controls, and it's got a big color touchscreen, $200. One thing to note, it does not have full powered ExpressLRS internal module. The internal ExpressLRS module on the TX16S is only 250 milliwatts. That is still plenty of range for most people for ordinary use, but all of the other radios we're going to look at go up to 1 watt. So in order to get that power with the TX16S, you would need to put a module in the external module bay, which a lot of people would object to doing. The Boxer. This radio is $100 in its base form. It does not have, that's without the AG01 gimbals that you see here. That's an aftermarket upgrade on mine. $100. It has fewer controls, but still as many controls as many people would need. Small LCD touchscreen and 1 watt internal ExpressLRS. The RadioMaster Boxer Crush cosmetic upgrade, you get the colored shell if that's what you're into. You get the AG01 gimbals, which are very, very nice. Comes in around $190. I got to say, between the Boxer Crush and the TX16S, well, obviously you know which one I would pick. They're about the same price. The Boxer has been my daily driver. I find the smaller form factor easier to pack, easier to transport. I find it actually nicer in the hand. It just fits my hands really well. And I live with the smaller screen and the lack of a touch screen because overall I think the usability and the ergonomics win out for me. $200. Does also have the internal 1 watt ExpressLRS module, so you get the max power there. Very good. And finally, the Jumper T15. Now, 1 watt internal ExpressLRS. Yes, got that. Ergonomics. To my hands, not quite as good as the Boxer, but still pretty good. Size-wise, pretty good, you know, about the same. Love the foldable antenna. Gimbals, not as good. Frankly, not even as good as the standard Hall effect gimbals on the RadioMaster radios, and not just because they don't have the external adjustments. I don't think they feel as nice, but they are still perfectly usable for the vast majority of people. Plethora of controls. In fact, arguably more controls than the Boxer because of the option to add switches up here at the top, and better controls because of these customizable 6-position switches, which the Boxer doesn't have. But of course, the real feature that's killer here is the screen, the color touch screen, which gives you all the functionality of the TX16S in a much smaller factor. Price here, $160, which is, that's about right. That's about right. Like, maybe you're going to pay more for the build quality of the RadioMaster Boxer Crush and the AG01 gimbals, or maybe you'd like a radio with slightly worse build quality. And yes, it's got to be said, historically, Jumper has had slightly worse build quality than RadioMaster. Like, if you just, like, you can't hold these radios in your hands like I am, but like, the Jumper just feels lighter. It feels less premium. It, like, I noticed when I was putting the batteries in. Check this out. Here's the battery tray cover for the Jumper. And like, I don't know, if I just sit here and wiggle them, they kind of feel the same. But like, when I was putting the Jumper one back on, it felt kind of flexy to my hand. And I was like, oh. Whereas when I put the Boxer one on, it just feels, I don't know if it's something to do with the way they've designed it. It just feels firmer, stiffer, more premium. Old versions of the Jumper gimbals had really thin wires going to the gimbals, and they were stiff wires, and they sometimes cracked and broke off. Like, these are just little things that historically, it's not like a deal breaker, but like, I just feel like if you pay a little more for the RadioMaster radios, you are getting just a little bit better made radio. And that's no doubt true for this radio as well. Nevertheless, it is currently the only radio in this form factor you can get with this awesome, awesome screen on it. And I think that that's going to be a compelling factor for a lot of people watching this video and sway you to this radio. And if you're feeling that way, I wouldn't talk you out of it. I'm probably just going to wait till RadioMaster inevitably releases their version of this radio and see how it stacks up. But if you don't want to wait, there's links in the video description below to where you can pick up this radio. And it means a lot when you use those links because they're affiliate links. Affiliate links means that when you make any purchase at the affiliated vendor, I get a small commission. It's a very small amount. It doesn't cost you anything extra, but it really does add up, and it really matters when you click those links. So please go ahead down to the links in the video description, save those links, bookmark them even, and just use them whenever you do your shopping. It really helps me out. Where do you go from here? 2 places. Number 1, if you really want to appreciate the power of the touchscreen, I want to show you how I set up my widgets on my RadioMaster TX16S. Widgets are how you can customize that main screen, and like, it's really just is going to sell you on wanting this touchscreen instead of the LCD screen. It hurts that I had to give those up. So I'm going to put a card on screen for that video if you want to check it out. Also, ExpressLRS. New to ExpressLRS? Well, you got to be able to bind it. I'm going to put a card on screen to my ExpressLRS flashing and binding setup video. I'll see you there.